The champagne flute slipped from Linda Harper's fingers, crystal shattering against the marble floor of their Westchester County estate. The sound echoed through the dining room where 47 guests had just finished celebrating what they thought was a beautiful marriage milestone. But the words her husband Richard had just whispered in her ear weren't anniversary wishes. They were a death sentence to everything she thought she knew about her life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You're past your expiration date. Linda, I've already spoken to my lawyer. At 67, Linda stood frozen among the remnants of their 45th wedding anniversary party, watching Richard shake hands with their neighbors, his political smile never wavering. The same smile that had charmed her in college, that had built his real estate empire, that had just destroyed her world in 8 calculated words. The morning after the anniversary party, Linda sat in her kitchen wearing the same dress from the night before, mascara smudged beneath her eyes, staring at divorce papers that had somehow materialized on the granite countertop beside her untouched coffee. The house felt different now, like a museum she was no longer welcome to inhabit. Every piece of furniture, every painting, every carefully chosen decorative element suddenly seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Richard had left early for his office, just as he had every morning for the past 4 decades, but this time he'd paused at the door with a coldness she'd never witnessed before. "My attorney will be in touch. You have 30 days to find other arrangements. The house goes on the market next week." No explanation, no conversation, just the sound of his Mercedes pulling out of the circular driveway that she had helped design 23 years ago when they'd built this dream home together. Linda had dedicated her entire adult life to being Mrs. Richard Harper. She'd abandoned her teaching career when their first child was born, channeled her energy into charity galas and country club committees, transformed herself into the perfect political wife when Richard ran for city council, then county commissioner. She'd hosted countless dinner parties, remembered every business associate's spouse's name, smiled through ribbon cuttings and fundraising events, until her cheeks ached. She'd been the woman behind the successful man, and now that man was discarding her like an outdated appliance. The phone rang constantly that morning. Friends who'd attended the party, confused by the sudden departure of several guests, after Richard's announcement, Linda let it ring. What could she possibly say? That her husband of 45 years had decided she was no longer useful. That the man who'd promised to love her until death do them part had decided she'd already died, at least in his eyes. She walked through their 5,000-square-foot home, past family photos spanning decades, past her children's graduation pictures, past vacation memories from European trips and beach houses. Every room told the story of a life she'd thought was permanent. The reading nook where she'd spent countless hours while Richard worked late. The kitchen where she'd prepared holiday meals for extended family. The garden room where she'd painted watercolors, a hobby Richard had always dismissively called cute. By noon, the house felt like a tomb. Linda found herself standing in Richard's study, a room she'd rarely entered without invitation. His mahogany desk commanded the space, surrounded by legal books and framed photographs of him with various political figures. But what caught her attention wasn't his obvious displays of success. It was a manila folder left carelessly open, containing documents that made her blood run cold. Financial statements showed accounts she'd never heard of. Property deeds bearing only Richard's name, including the beach house in the Hamptons she'd always believed they owned together. Investment portfolios worth millions, that somehow existed entirely outside her knowledge. But most shocking of all was a prenuptial agreement dated just 3 months before their wedding. Her signature forged so expertly she almost believed she'd signed it herself. Linda's hands trembled as she photographed each document with her phone, her teacher's instincts for documentation serving her well even in crisis. 45 years of marriage, and she was discovering her husband had been planning his exit strategy since before they'd even said their vow. The financial records painted a picture of systematic deception that stretched back decades. The woman staring back at her from the hallway mirror looked like a strange gray hair that she'd been thinking about coloring again, laugh lines that had deepened around eyes that now held confusion instead of joy. Hands that showed the spots and wrinkles of a woman who'd lived fully but was now being told her time was over. She barely recognized herself, and she realized with growing horror that she barely knew herself either. Who was Linda Harper without Richard? She'd been so busy being his wife, his partner, his accessory, that she'd lost track of who she'd been before him. She'd met Richard during her senior year at State College, where she'd been studying education with dreams of teaching high school English. Those dreams had been shelved, then forgotten, replaced by the seemingly more important work of building Richard's career and raising their children. Their two children, Michael and Patricia, both lived across the country now, busy with their own families and careers. Michael was a surgeon in Seattle, Patricia a marketing executive in San Francisco. They called on holidays and visited for long weekends twice a year, but their lives had naturally moved forward while hers had remained static, centered entirely around Richard's needs and schedule. The phone rang again, and this time Linda answered. It was Margaret Fleming, her closest friend from the country club, her voice filled with concern and curiosity. "Linda, dear, what on earth happened last night?" Richard made some announcement that I couldn't quite hear, and then people started leaving so quickly. "Are you all right?" Linda opened her mouth to give the polite, dismissive response she'd perfected over decades of protecting Richard's image, but instead found herself telling the truth. "He's divorcing me, Margaret. After 45 years, he's decided I'm past my expiration date." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Linda thought the call had dropped. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Linda, I had no idea. I'm so sorry. What can I do? Do you need somewhere to stay?" The offer of help broke something loose inside Linda's chest. For the first time since the champagne glass had shattered, she cried. Not the silent tears of shock, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from a place she'd kept locked away for decades. She cried for the woman she'd been, for the dreams she'd abandoned, for the trust that had been so thoroughly betrayed. Margaret arrived within an hour, bringing coffee and the kind of fierce loyalty that only decades of friendship can provide. She listened without judgment, as Linda explained about the papers, the hidden assets, the forged prenuptial agreement. Margaret's own divorce 15 years earlier had taught her exactly what questions to ask. "You need a lawyer, Linda. Not just any lawyer, but someone who specializes in complex divorces involving hidden assets. And you need one today. I don't even know where to start. Richard handles all our finances. I don't even know what accounts we have, let alone how to afford an attorney." Margaret pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. "Do you remember Catherine Walsh from the hospital auxiliary? She went through something similar with her husband 5 years ago. He tried to hide assets offshore, claimed poverty while living in luxury. She got one of the best attorneys in the state." Linda remembered Catherine, a quiet woman who'd seemed to disappear from their social circle after her divorce. She'd assumed Catherine had been too embarrassed by her circumstances to continue participating in their activity. Now she wondered if Catherine had simply been excluded by the same people who would likely exclude Linda once word of her situation spread. Margaret made the call, speaking in hushed tones before handing Linda the phone. Catherine's voice was warm and immediately understanding. "Linda, I heard about last night from Margaret. I want you to know that what you're feeling right now, that sense of complete disorientation, is normal. You're not crazy, and you're not alone. Can you meet me for coffee tomorrow morning? There's someone I'd like you to meet." For the first time in 24 hours, Linda felt a tiny spark of something that might eventually become hope. She wasn't just a discarded wife. She was a woman who'd been wronged, and apparently there were people who understood exactly what that meant. That evening, Linda sat alone in her dining room, surrounded by the debris of her anniversary party. The caterers had cleaned up most of the mess, but scattered champagne flutes and abandoned napkins remained as evidence of the celebration that had turned into a wake for her marriage. She'd spent the day moving like a sleepwalker through her own life, but now, in the quiet of approaching darkness, she began to feel something new stirring beneath the shock and grief. Anger. Not the polite irritation she'd occasionally felt when Richard forgot an anniversary or made decisions without consulting her, but a deep, burning rage at the sheer audacity of his betrayal. He'd stolen decades of her life through deception, built his success on her unpaid labor, and now expected her to simply disappear quietly while he enjoyed the fruits of their shared efforts with someone younger. Linda walked to her laptop, one of the few pieces of technology in the house that was truly hers, and began to search. She researched divorce attorneys, hidden asset investigations, and women's rights in long-term marriage. She read stories of other women who'd been discarded after decades of marriage, women who'd fought back and won. With each article, each case study, each success story, her anger transformed into something more powerful: determination. She created a new email account using her maiden name, Linda Morrison, a name she hadn't used in 45 years. She began documenting everything she could remember about their finances, their properties, Richard's business dealing. Her teaching background served her well. She'd always been organized, methodical, good with details. Skills she'd used to manage their household and social calendar could be repurposed for something far more important: fighting for her future. The woman who went to bed that night was not the same woman who'd woken up that morning. Linda Harper, the dutiful wife, was being replaced by someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous to Richard's carefully constructed plan. She didn't know yet what she was capable of, but she was about to find out. As she lay in the king-sized bed she'd shared with Richard for 2 decades, staring at the ceiling of a house that would soon belong to someone else, Linda made a decision that would change everything. She wouldn't go quietly, she wouldn't disappear, and she certainly wouldn't let Richard Harper determine her expiration date. The next morning would bring new challenges, new revelations, and new allies, but it would also bring the beginning of Linda's transformation from victim to victim. Her trust fund wasn't just getting started, her entire life was about to begin again, and this time she would be the one writing the rules. Catherine Walsh was nothing like Linda had expected. Instead of the broken, bitter woman she'd imagined, Catherine radiated confidence and energy that seemed to light up the corner booth at Millfield Cafe where they'd agreed to meet. Her silver hair was styled in a chic bob, her makeup flawless despite the early hour, and her handshake was firm enough to belong to a CEO. "I know that look," Catherine said, settling into her seat with the ease of someone completely comfortable in her own skin. 3 years ago I had the same expression, like I'd been living someone else's life, and just woke up to find myself trapped in it. Linda wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, grateful for the warmth against her suddenly cold fingers. "How did you know about your husband? How did you figure out what he was hiding?" Catherine's laugh held no bitterness, only a kind of rueful wisdom. "I didn't figure it out at all. He handed me divorce papers on a Tuesday morning and told me I'd get the house and whatever was left in our joint checking account. About $12,000. As it turned out, he claimed that was all we had after 38 years of marriage, but that wasn't true, not even close. David had been systematically moving money into offshore accounts for over a decade. He owned 3 properties I'd never heard of, had investment portfolios worth millions, and had been claiming business losses on paper while secretly profiting through shell companies." Catherine sipped her coffee calmly, as if discussing the weather rather than elaborate financial fraud. Linda felt her stomach clench. "How did you find out?" "I hired Elizabeth Chen. She's a forensic accountant who specializes in uncovering hidden assets in divorce cases. She's brilliant, thorough, and absolutely ruthless when it comes to tracking down money that's been hidden from spouses. She found everything David thought he'd buried, and then some." The name meant nothing to Linda, but Catherine's tone suggested it should. "Is she expensive?" "Very, but she works on contingency for cases like yours. She gets paid when you get paid, and trust me, if there's money to be found, Elizabeth will find it." Catherine leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious. "Linda, I need to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Over the years, did Richard ever have you sign documents without fully explaining what they were? Tax forms, business papers, anything where he said it was just routine paperwork?" Linda's mind raced back through decades of marriage. How many times had Richard thrust papers in front of her while she was cooking dinner or getting ready for bed, asking for her signature while barely glancing up from his own work? She'd trusted him completely, signed whatever he put in front of her without question. "Yes," she whispered. "Many times. He said it was just tax stuff, or business paperwork that needed both our signatures. Catherine nodded grimly. Elizabeth will want to see everything you can remember about those documents. Richard's been planning this for a long time, Linda. Men like him don't make impulsive decisions about divorce, they lay groundwork. Sometimes for years. The revelation hit Linda like a physical blow. While she'd been planning anniversary parties and managing their social calendar, Richard had been planning her disposal. Every signature she'd trustingly provided had been another link in the chains he was forging around her future. There's something else, Catherine continued. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elizabeth doesn't just find hidden money, she finds evidence of deception, fraud, sometimes even criminal activity. When she's done with her investigation, you won't just have leverage in the divorce. You'll have Richard exactly where you want him. Catherine handed Linda a business card with simple black lettering. Elizabeth Chen, CPA, CFE, Forensic Financial Investigation. Call her today. Don't wait. Every day. You delay gives Richard more time to move assets or destroy evidence. Linda stared at the card, feeling as if she were holding a weapon she didn't yet know how to use. What if I can't afford her retainer? Tell her Catherine Walsh referred you, and that you have reason to believe your husband has been hiding assets for decades. She'll take the case. Catherine's smile was sharp and knowing. Trust me, Elizabeth loves cases like yours. She has a special hatred for men who think they can outsmart the system and dispose of their wives like used furniture. They parted ways in the parking lot, but not before Catherine gave Linda a fierce hug. 6 months from now, you're going to look back on this conversation as the moment your real life began. Richard thinks he holds all the cards, but he's about to discover that underestimating you was the biggest mistake of his calculating life. Linda drove home through Millfield's tree-lined streets, past the boutiques and galleries where she'd spent countless afternoons during her marriage, feeling like she was seeing everything with new eyes. These weren't just shops where she'd killed time while Richard worked. They were businesses run by women who'd built their own lives, made their own decisions, controlled their own destinies. Back at the house that would soon be sold out from under her, Linda found Richard in his study, speaking in low tones on his phone. He glanced up when she entered, his expression shifting from annoyance to something that might have been guilt before settling back into cold indifference. I'm working, Linda. We can discuss logistics later. Actually, we need to discuss them now. Linda's voice was steadier than she'd expected. I want to understand the timeline you've established for this divorce. Richard ended his call and leaned back in his leather chair, studying her with the same calculating expression he'd used when evaluating real estate deals. The house goes on the market Friday. My attorney will file the paperwork Monday. You have until the 1st of next month to find somewhere else to live. And our assets? How exactly do you plan to divide 45 years of accumulated wealth? Something flickered across Richard's face too quick for Linda to identify. As I mentioned, there's a prenuptial agreement that governs the distribution of assets. You'll receive what's specified in that document. Linda felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I'd like to see that agreement. My attorney has the original. You'll get a copy when the paperwork is filed. Richard, we need to talk about this properly. 45 years of marriage can't just be dissolved with a 30-day notice. I have rights. Richard's laugh was short and unpleasant. You have exactly the rights outlined in the prenuptial agreement you signed. Nothing more, nothing less. He turned back to his computer, clearly considering the conversation over. Linda left his study with her heart pounding, but not from fear. For the first time since the anniversary party, she felt energized rather than devastated. Richard's casual cruelty had just provided her with crucial information. He was absolutely confident that the forged prenuptial agreement would protect him, which meant he had no idea she'd discovered it or photographed his hidden financial documents. She called Elizabeth Chen from her car, parked in the driveway of what had been her home for over 2 decades. The voice that answered was crisp and professional, with an underlying steel that immediately put Linda at ease. Miss Chen, my name is Linda Harper. Catherine Walsh suggested I call you. I believe my husband has been hiding assets and may have forged a prenuptial agreement. Miss Harper, Catherine mentioned you might be calling. Can you meet me this afternoon? I have an opening at 3 o'clock. Elizabeth Chen's office was located in a sleek downtown building that screamed success and competence. The waiting room was decorated in calming blues and grays, with original artwork and furniture that suggested someone who appreciated quality and paid attention to details. Linda barely had time to settle into one of the comfortable chairs before a door opened and Elizabeth Chen emerged. She was younger than Linda had expected, perhaps in her early 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes behind stylish glasses and an aura of focused intensity that was immediately reassuring. Her handshake was firm, her smile warm but businesslike. "Mrs. Harper, please come in. Catherine told me a bit about your situation, but I'd like to hear the details directly from you." Elizabeth's office was impressive without being intimidating, filled with law books, financial texts, and multiple computer monitors displaying complex spreadsheets and databases. The wall behind her desk was covered with framed certificates and awards, testament to her expertise in forensic accounting and financial investigation. "Before we begin," Elizabeth said, settling behind her desk, "I want you to understand exactly what I do and how I can help you. I specialize in uncovering hidden assets in divorce cases, but I also investigate financial fraud, tax evasion, and other white-collar crimes. When I take a case, I don't just look at bank statements. I reconstruct entire financial histories, trace money through multiple accounts and jurisdictions, and build comprehensive pictures of deception." Linda felt a surge of hope mixed with apprehension. "How long does that usually take?" "Depends on the complexity of the deception and how long it's been going on. But Mrs. Harper, I need to warn you about something. When I investigate cases like yours, I usually find much more than hidden marital assets. I often uncover evidence of tax fraud, business irregularities, sometimes even criminal activity. Are you prepared for the possibility that your husband's deception might extend far beyond your divorce?" Linda thought about the documents she'd photographed, the casual way Richard had lied about their prenuptial agreement, the decades of financial decisions made without her knowledge or input. "Yes, I think I am." Elizabeth smiled, and for the first time, Linda saw something predatory in her expression. "Good, because based on what Catherine told me about your husband's business dealings and political connections, I suspect we're going to find evidence of much more than simple asset hiding." They spent the next 2 hours going over Linda's memories of their financial life, the documents she'd found in Richard's study, and her growing suspicions about the forged prenuptial agreement. Elizabeth took detailed notes, asking probing questions that helped Linda remember details she'd forgotten or dismissed as unimportant. "Mrs. Harper, I'm going to be frank with you. Your husband has made several critical mistakes. First, he's been sloppy about hiding his tracks, probably because he's assumed you would never investigate or fight back. Second, he's left evidence of his deception lying around where you could find it. And third, he's underestimated you completely." Elizabeth pulled up a contract on her computer and turned the monitor so Linda could read it. "This is my standard agreement for cases involving hidden assets. I work on contingency, which means you don't pay me unless I recover money for you. My fee is 30% of whatever I find above what your husband has disclosed. Given the scope of what we're likely to uncover, I estimate you'll end up with significantly more money than you would have received through a conventional divorce settlement." Linda stared at the contract, hardly believing what she was reading. "You're saying I might actually be better off financially after the divorce than I was during the marriage. Mrs. Harper, if I'm right about what your husband has been hiding, you're not just going to be better off. You're going to be independently wealthy, and more importantly, you're going to have evidence that will prevent him from ever attempting to control or manipulate you again." Linda signed the contract with a hand that didn't tremble, feeling as if she were signing her Declaration of Independence. Elizabeth immediately began outlining the investigation process, explaining how she would trace financial records, subpoena bank documents, and reconstruct years of hidden transactions. "The first thing I'm going to do is run a comprehensive asset search on your husband and his businesses. I have access to databases that track property ownership, corporate filings, investment accounts, and offshore holdings. By tomorrow morning, I'll have a preliminary picture of what he's been hiding." As Linda left Elizabeth's office, she felt transformed. The frightened, confused woman, who'd discovered divorce papers on her kitchen counter, was being replaced by someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous to Richard's carefully laid plans. She wasn't just hiring a forensic accountant, she was assembling an army. That evening, Linda sat in her living room with a glass of wine, surrounded by photo albums and documents she'd gathered from throughout the house. She was building her own evidence file, documenting their life together in ways that would support Elizabeth's investigation. Marriage certificates, tax returns, property deeds, insurance policies, business correspondence, all pieces of a puzzle that would eventually reveal the full scope of Richard's deception. Richard came home late, as he had every night for the past week, barely acknowledging her presence as he headed straight to his study. But Linda watched him differently now, noting the way he carefully locked his filing cabinets, how he kept his phone with him at all times, the way he seemed to be systematically removing personal items from common areas of the house. He thought he was being clever, methodically erasing evidence of their shared life while preparing for his new beginning. What he didn't realize was that every action he took was being observed and documented by a woman who was no longer the trusting wife he'd taken for granted for decades. Linda's phone buzzed with a text from Elizabeth: "Preliminary results tomorrow at 2 p.m. You're going to want to sit down for this conversation." As Linda prepared for bed in the house that had been her home for over 20 years, she felt something she hadn't experienced in decades: excitement about her future. Richard thought he was discarding her, but he was actually liberating her. And tomorrow she would begin to understand just how much power she'd actually possessed all along. Elizabeth Chen's office felt different when Linda arrived for their afternoon meeting. The atmosphere was charged with an energy that reminded Linda of newsrooms in movies, moments before a major story broke. Elizabeth sat behind her desk with a stack of printouts several inches thick, her expression a mixture of professional satisfaction and barely contained outrage. "Miss Harper, please, sit down. What I'm about to show you is going to fundamentally change how you view your marriage and your husband." Elizabeth's voice carried the weight of someone delivering life-altering news. "In 24 hours of investigation, I've uncovered a financial deception so systematic and extensive that it borders on criminal enterprise." Linda settled into the chair across from Elizabeth's desk, her hands folded in her lap to stop them from shaking. "How bad is your husband has been living a double life for at least 15 years, possibly longer. He owns property in 7 states, has investment accounts in 3 countries, and controls assets worth approximately $47 million, none of which appears on any financial disclosure he's ever provided to you or, more importantly, to the IRS." The number hit Linda like a physical blow: $47 million. During their marriage, Richard had consistently claimed they were comfortable but not wealthy, that his real estate business provided a good living but nothing extravagant. She'd worried about their retirement security, had suggested she return to teaching to supplement their income, had carefully managed household expenses to avoid being a financial burden. "I don't understand, how is that possible? We filed joint tax returns. Wouldn't I have seen evidence of that kind of money?" Elizabeth turned her computer monitor toward Linda, displaying a complex flowchart that looked like a spider web of interconnected boxes and arrows. "Your husband has been using a network of shell companies, offshore accounts, and fraudulent partnerships to hide income and assets. The joint tax returns you've been signing show only a fraction of his actual earnings. He's been committing tax fraud on a massive scale." Linda stared at the screen, trying to process the implications. "Those documents he had me sign over the years. You've been unknowingly signing paperwork that established you as a nominal partner in businesses that exist only on paper, businesses that were created specifically to hide money and evade taxes." Elizabeth highlighted several boxes on the flowchart. "See these companies: Morrison Holdings, Westfield Development, Harbor Properties. You're listed as a founding partner in all of them, despite never having any actual involvement in their operations." The revelation was staggering. Not only had Richard been hiding their wealth, but he'd been using Linda as an unwitting accomplice in financial fraud. Every signature she'd provided out of trust and love had been another tool in his scheme to evade taxes and deceive authorities. "Elizabeth, what does this mean for me legally? If my name is on these companies, Am I liable for whatever Richard has been doing? That's actually the beautiful irony of your situation. By using you as a nominal partner without your knowledge, Richard has created a paper trail that proves you were a victim of his deception, rather than a willing participant. More importantly, as his legal spouse, you have legitimate claims to half of everything he's been hiding. Elizabeth pulled out another set of documents, these bearing official seals and legal stamps. I've already filed preliminary motions to freeze all accounts associated with Richard and his shell company. As of this morning, he can't move money, sell properties, or liquidate investments without court approval. Linda felt a surge of something that might have been vindication, followed immediately by fear. Won't that alert him to what we're doing? He'll know I'm fighting back. Mrs. Harper, Richard is going to find out, regardless. But here's what he doesn't know yet. Elizabeth's smile was sharp and predatory. The forensic analysis I've conducted has uncovered evidence of federal tax evasion, wire fraud, and money laundering. I've already been in contact with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division and the FBI's white-collar crime unit. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Linda felt the room spin slightly as the full implications sank in. Richard is going to be investigated for federal crimes. Mrs. Harper, Richard is going to be arrested. The evidence I've uncovered shows systematic financial fraud spanning over a decade. We're not just talking about hidden marital assets anymore. We're talking about criminal activity that carries significant prison time. Elizabeth leaned back in her chair, studying Linda's reaction carefully. I need you to understand what this means for your situation. Richard's entire strategy of divorcing you while keeping his hidden wealth depends on you being ignorant and compliant. But he's built his house of cards on a foundation of federal crimes, and that foundation is about to collapse. Linda struggled to process the magnitude of what she was hearing. The man she'd been married to for 45 years wasn't just a deceptive husband, he was an alleged criminal who'd been using their marriage as cover for financial fraud. What happens now? Several things, all of them working in your favor. First, the federal investigation will take precedence over any divorce proceedings. Richard's assets will remain frozen while authorities determine the full scope of his criminal activity. Second, as his spouse, you have significant protections under federal law. The government wants to recover the stolen tax revenue, but they also want to ensure that innocent spouses aren't punished for their partner's crimes. Elizabeth pulled out a thick folder labeled with Linda's name. More importantly, the evidence I've gathered proves that you're entitled to half of everything Richard has accumulated during your marriage, including all the money he's been hiding. But since he's been committing crimes to hide that money, the courts are going to be very sympathetic to your position. How much money are we really talking about? Based on my analysis, your legitimate share of marital assets is approximately $23.5 million. But here's where it gets interesting. Elizabeth's expression became almost gleeful. Richard's criminal activity means that some of his assets are subject to forfeiture. However, as his innocent spouse, you can claim those assets before the government seizes them. In practical terms, you could end up with significantly more than half. Linda sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile the numbers Elizabeth was citing with the financial anxiety she'd carried throughout her marriage. $23 million was more money than she'd ever imagined having access to. It was generational wealth, security beyond anything she'd dreamed possible. There's something else, Elizabeth continued. The prenuptial agreement Richard has been counting on to limit your settlement. It's not just forged, it's irrelevant. Prenuptial agreements can't protect assets acquired through criminal activity. Even if you had legitimately signed such an agreement, it would be void in the face of evidence that Richard was using marital funds for illegal purposes. Elizabeth handed Linda a business card with the name David Rodriguez, followed by titles that emphasized his expertise in federal criminal defense and white-collar crime. This is the attorney who's going to represent you in the criminal aspects of this case. He specializes in protecting innocent spouses when their partners are investigated for financial crimes. Linda took the card with fingers that had regained their steadiness. For the first time since Richard had announced his intention to divorce her, She felt like she was holding winning cards instead of struggling to survive his decisions. Mrs. Harper, I want you to understand something crucial. Richard's plan to discard you after 45 years of marriage was built on his assumption that you would remain ignorant of his true financial situation. He never imagined that you would fight back, and he certainly never imagined that his criminal activity would be exposed. Elizabeth gathered the documents spread across her desk, organizing them into neat piles. Tomorrow morning, federal agents will execute search warrants on Richard's office, his business properties, and your home. They'll be looking for financial records, computer files, and any other evidence related to his fraudulent activities. The thought of federal agents searching their home felt surreal, but Linda found herself more curious than frightened. Will I be questioned? Extensively, but as a witness and potential victim, not as a suspect. David Rodriguez will be with you throughout any questioning to ensure your rights are protected. Elizabeth's expression became more serious. Linda, I need you to be prepared for what's coming. This investigation is going to expose every aspect of Richard's deception. You're going to learn things about your husband that will be difficult to process. What kind of thing? Financial records suggest that Richard has been maintaining a second residence in Manhattan, one that doesn't appear on any documents you've ever seen. There are also significant cash withdrawals and credit card charges that suggest he's been supporting someone else's lifestyle for several years. The implication was clear, though Elizabeth didn't state it directly. Richard hadn't just been hiding money, he'd likely been hiding an entire relationship. The man who'd claimed Linda was past her expiration date had apparently been investing in someone he considered more valuable. Linda felt a strange sense of relief rather than the jealousy or hurt she might have expected. Learning that Richard had been unfaithful actually made his cruelty easier to understand and forgive. He hadn't suddenly stopped loving her. He'd been living a lie for years, and she'd simply become inconvenient to maintaining that lie. Elizabeth, can I ask you something personal? How many cases like this have you worked on? Cases involving hidden assets and financial fraud, dozens. But cases where the deception was this extensive and the innocent spouse was this completely unaware, maybe 3 or 4. Elizabeth paused, choosing her words carefully. Linda, what Richard did to you goes beyond typical marital deception. He constructed an entire fictional reality around your marriage while systematically stealing from the government and preparing to abandon you with nothing. And now he's about to discover that underestimating you was the most expensive mistake of his life. Linda left Elizabeth's office, feeling like she was walking through a different world than the one she'd inhabited that morning. The tree-lined streets of downtown Millfield looked the same, but everything felt charged with possibility instead of dread. She wasn't just surviving Richard's betrayal, she was about to emerge from it, wealthier and more powerful than she'd ever imagined possible. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret. How did the meeting go? Call me when you can talk. Instead of calling, Linda drove to Margaret's house, a sprawling colonial in an older section of town that Margaret had kept after her own divorce. She found her friend in the garden, tending to late-season roses with the focused attention of someone who found peace in nurturing growing things. Linda, I've been worried about you all day. How was the meeting with the forensic accountant? Linda settled onto Margaret's garden bench, still processing everything Elizabeth had revealed. Margaret, Richard has been hiding $47 million. Margaret's pruning shears clattered to the ground. I'm sorry, did you say 47 million? And that's just what she found in the first day of investigation. There's more, much more. Richard's been committing federal crimes, using shell companies to hide money and evade taxes. The FBI is going to arrest him. Margaret sank onto the bench beside Linda, her face pale with shock. Linda, are you absolutely certain about this? $47 million seems impossible. Richard's successful, but he's not wealthy enough to hide that kind of money. That's exactly what he wanted everyone to think, including me. But Elizabeth has documentation, bank records, property deeds, everything. She's already frozen his accounts and contacted federal authorities. Margaret was quiet for several minutes, staring at her roses as if they might provide answers to questions she hadn't known to ask. What does this mean for you? Practically, I mean, It means I'm going to be independently wealthy instead of destitute. It means Richard's plan to dispose of me while keeping his hidden fortune is going to backfire spectacularly. Linda felt a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. It means that when Richard told me I was past my expiration date, he had no idea he was talking to a woman who was about to become one of the wealthiest divorcees in the state. Margaret laughed, a sound that was equal parts amazement and vindication. Linda, do you realize what this means? You're not just getting justice, you're getting revenge on a scale that would make Shakespeare proud. That evening, Linda returned to the house she'd shared with Richard for over 2 decades. But everything felt different now. She wasn't a displaced person waiting for eviction. She was a woman conducting surveillance on someone who'd been systematically defrauding her for years. Every room held new significance. Every document, new potential value as evidence. Richard was in his study when she arrived, speaking quietly on his phone as he had every evening for the past week. But tonight, Linda didn't hurry past his partially open door. Instead, she lingered in the hallway listening to fragments of conversation that took on sinister new meaning in light of what she'd learned. The timeline needs to be accelerated, she heard him say. I want everything transferred by the end of the week. No, she doesn't suspect anything. She's been completely compliant since the announcement. The apartment lease is already signed. Everything will be ready by the time the house closes. Linda felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening temperature. Richard wasn't just planning to divorce her. He was planning to disappear with his hidden wealth, leaving her with nothing while he started a new life with money she'd helped him accumulate through decades of unwitting cooperation. She continued to her bedroom, but instead of the despair she'd felt for the past week, she felt something far more energizing. Anticipation. Tomorrow morning, federal agents would shatter Richard's carefully constructed world of deception. The man who thought he'd checkmated her in 8 words was about to discover that the game was far from over. Linda changed into comfortable clothes and settled into her reading chair with a cup of tea, but instead of picking up a book, she opened her laptop and began researching federal investigations, asset forfeiture and the rights of innocent spouses in white-collar crime cases. She was no longer just Richard's soon-to-be ex-wife, she was a woman preparing for war, and she intended to win decisively. Her phone rang near midnight, Elizabeth's name appearing on the screen despite the late hour. Mrs. Harper, I wanted to give you a heads up. The federal search warrants will be executed at 8:30 tomorrow morning. Agent Sarah Collins will be leading the team that searches your home. She's been briefed on your situation and will ensure you're treated appropriately throughout the process. Elizabeth, what should I expect? How long will they be here? Several hours, possibly all day. They'll be very thorough. But they're not looking for evidence against you. They're looking for evidence of Richard's crimes. Agent Collins will explain everything as it happened. Linda thanked Elizabeth and ended the call, then walked to her bedroom window and looked out at the circular driveway where Richard's Mercedes sat gleaming under the security lights. Tomorrow morning, federal agents would drive up that same driveway and Richard's world would change forever. She was still awake when she heard Richard's study door close and his footsteps on the stairs. He passed their bedroom without stopping, continuing to one of the guest rooms where he'd been sleeping since announcing the divorce. Linda lay in the darkness, listening to the sounds of her husband preparing for what he thought would be another ordinary day in his carefully planned deception. If only he knew that his past her expiration date wife had just orchestrated the most expensive wake-up call of his life. The black SUVs arrived at exactly 8:30, their tinted windows reflecting the morning sun as they pulled into the circular driveway Linda had watched from her bedroom window just hours earlier. She stood at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee she hadn't touched, dressed in her best navy suit as if preparing for the most important business meeting of her life. In many ways she was. Agent Sarah Collins stepped out of the lead vehicle, a woman in her early 40s with short blonde hair and the kind of confident stride that suggested she'd done this countless times before. She wore a crisp black pantsuit and carried herself with the authority of someone accustomed to dismantling carefully constructed lies. Behind her, 6 other agents emerged from the vehicles, some carrying briefcases, others wheeling equipment cases that looked sophisticated enough to uncover secrets buried in the deepest corners of any computer system. Linda opened the front door before Agent Collins could ring the bell, a gesture that wasn't lost on the federal investigator. Mrs. Harper, I'm Agent Collins. We spoke briefly yesterday through your attorney. Thank you for your cooperation with this investigation. Agent Collins, please come in. Can I offer you coffee? This is going to be a long day for all of us. The agent's expression softened slightly, appreciation flickering across her professional demeanor. That's very kind, but we need to get started immediately. Is your husband currently in the house? He left for his office about 20 minutes ago. Same routine he's followed for 45 years, though I suspect today will be quite different for him. Agent Collins nodded to her team, and they began moving through the house with practiced efficiency. Mrs. Harper, I want you to understand what's happening here today. We have warrants to search for financial documents, computer records, and any evidence related to the financial crimes we're investigating. We're not looking for anything that would implicate you personally. Based on our investigation, you appear to be a victim rather than a willing participant. Linda watched as agents spread throughout her home, some heading directly to Richard's study, while others began examining filing cabinets and computer equipment in other rooms. Agent Collins, how extensive is this investigation? Are other properties being searched as well? Mr. Harper's business offices, his storage facilities, and several properties he owns are being searched simultaneously. We've also executed warrants for his bank records, computer files, and communication records, going back 10 years. Agent Collins consulted a tablet computer. Miss Harper, we're going to need to ask you some detailed questions about your knowledge of your husband's business activities and financial affairs. David Rodriguez arrived within the hour. The attorney Elizabeth had recommended to handle the criminal aspects of Linda's case. He was a tall man with graying temples and the kind of calm confidence that came from decades of navigating federal investigations. His handshake was firm, his eyes intelligent and reassuring. Miss Harper, I've reviewed the preliminary evidence that Elizabeth Chen provided, and I want you to know that you're in an excellent position legally. The federal prosecutors have no interest in pursuing charges against you. Their focus is entirely on your husband's criminal activity. Agent Collins led them to the dining room, away from the controlled chaos of the search. Mrs. Harper, I'm going to record this interview for accuracy. Mr. Rodriguez will be present throughout, and you can stop at any time if you need a break or want to consult with your attorney. The questions that followed were methodical and thorough, covering decades of Linda's marriage in minute detail. Agent Collins wanted to know about every document Richard had asked her to sign, every business trip he'd taken, every unusual financial transaction she could remember. Linda found herself recalling details she'd forgotten, patterns of behavior that had seemed innocent at the time, but now appeared sinister in retrospect. Mrs. Harper, do you recall your husband ever mentioning companies called Morrison Holdings, Westfield Development, or Harbor Property? Morrison Holdings sounds familiar. That's my maiden name, Morrison. I remember Richard saying something about using it for a business venture, but he never gave me details. He said it was just paperwork, something about tax advantages. Agent Collins exchanged glances with David Rodriguez. Mrs. Harper, you're listed as the president and majority shareholder of Morrison Holdings, a company that has received over $8 million in transfers from your husband's other businesses over the past 5 years. Linda felt the blood drain from her face. I had no idea. I never signed anything establishing a company, and I certainly never received any money from such a company. That's exactly what we expected you to say, and it's exactly what the evidence supports. Your husband used your identity to create these shell companies without your knowledge or consent. This actually strengthens your legal position significantly. David Rodriguez leaned forward, his expression serious but encouraging. Linda, what Agent Collins is telling you is that Richard committed identity theft against you in addition to his other crimes. He stole your name and your reputation to further his illegal schemes. This makes you a victim of multiple federal crimes. Agent Collins continued her questioning, exploring Linda's knowledge of Richard's real estate investments, his business partnerships, and his travel patterns. Each answer Linda provided seemed to confirm the investigators' theories about the scope of Richard's deception. Miss Harper, Were you aware that your husband maintained a residence in Manhattan? No, absolutely not. He travels to New York occasionally for business, but he always stays in hotels. At least, that's what he's always told me. We have records showing that Miss Harper has been paying rent on a luxury apartment on the Upper East Side for the past 3 years. The lease is in his name only, but the rent payments come from accounts that should have been considered marital assets. The revelation hit Linda like a physical blow, but not in the way she might have expected. Instead of jealousy or hurt, she felt a surge of cold fury at the sheer audacity of Richard's deception. He'd been living a completely separate life while making her feel guilty for suggesting they could afford small luxuries for their home. Agent Collins, is there someone else, another woman? Based on the financial evidence, yeah, we believe your husband has been supporting another person's lifestyle using hidden marital assets. Credit card records show significant expenditures on jewelry, clothing, and luxury goods that were never intended for you. David Rodriguez placed a comforting hand on Linda's shoulder. Linda, I know this is difficult to hear, but remember what this means legally. Richard has been using marital funds to support his affair, which gives you additional claims in the divorce proceedings. Adultery supported by hidden marital assets is something divorce courts take very seriously. The interview continued for 3 hours, covering every aspect of Linda's marriage and her gradual realization that she'd been living with a stranger who'd been systematically defrauding her and the government for years. When Agent Collins finally turned off the recording equipment, Linda felt emotionally drained but oddly liberated. Mrs. Harper, thank you for your cooperation. Your testimony has been extremely helpful in building our case against your husband. I want you to know that the evidence we've gathered today will likely result in significant federal charges being filed against Mr. Harper within the next few weeks. As if summoned by Agent Collins' words, Linda's phone rang with Richard's name appearing on the screen. She looked questioningly at Agent Collins, who nodded for her to answer. Linda, what the hell is going on? There are federal agents crawling all over my office, and they've seized all my computers and files. They're asking questions about companies I've never heard of and bank accounts that don't exist. Linda looked directly at Agent Collins as she responded, her voice steadier than she'd expected. Richard, I think you should call your attorney. It sounds like you're going to need one. This is some kind of mistake. I run a legitimate business. I've never done anything illegal. Richard, federal agents are searching our house right now. They have evidence of financial crimes going back years. This isn't a mistake. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Linda thought the call had ended. When Richard finally spoke, his voice carried a tone she'd never heard before, a mixture of panic and cold calculation. Linda, I don't know what lies someone has been telling you, but you need to be very careful about making accusations you can't prove. Our prenuptial agreement protects both of us from exactly this kind of situation. Agent Collins was taking notes as Linda responded. Richard, I know about the forged prenuptial agreement. I know about the shell companies you created, using my identity. I know about the Manhattan apartment, and the woman you've been supporting with our money. This time the silence was even longer. When Richard spoke again, his voice had changed completely, becoming the cold, threatening tone of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. Linda, you have no idea what you're playing with. You don't understand the complexity of my business dealings, and you certainly don't understand the consequences of interfering with them. I suggest you reconsider whatever course of action you think you're pursuing. Agent Collins held up her hand, indicating that Linda should end the call. Richard, I understand perfectly. I understand that you've been stealing from me for decades while making me feel grateful for whatever scraps you chose to share. I understand that you planned to dispose of me while keeping money that legally belongs to both of us. And I understand that underestimating me was the biggest mistake of your very foolish life. Linda ended the call and looked at Agent Collins with a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. Was it wise to let him know how much I've discovered? Miss Harper, your husband already knows his world is falling apart. What he doesn't know is how much evidence we've gathered or how thoroughly his criminal activity has been documented. His reaction to your call tells us everything we need to know about his state of mind. David Rodriguez was reviewing notes he'd taken during the phone call. Linda, Richard's threatening tone was recorded and witnessed by federal agents. If he attempts to intimidate you or interfere with this investigation in any way, he'll be adding obstruction of justice and witness intimidation to his growing list of federal charges. The search of the house continued until late afternoon, with agents systematically examining every room, every filing cabinet, every computer and electronic device. They were particularly thorough in Richard's study, where they discovered a hidden safe behind a bookshelf that contained documents Linda had never seen before. Agent Collins emerged from the study carrying several boxes of evidence, her expression suggesting they'd found exactly what they'd been looking for. Mrs. Harper, the documents we've recovered today provide a complete picture of your husband's criminal enterprise. We have evidence of tax evasion, wire fraud, money laundering, and several other federal offenses. What happens next? Mr. Harper will be arrested within the next few days. Given the extent of his criminal activity and the significant flight risk he represents, he'll likely be denied bail. The assets we've frozen will remain frozen until the criminal proceedings are complete and the court determines restitution amounts. David Rodriguez gathered his materials and prepared to leave with the federal agent. Linda, I want you to understand that you're about to enter a very complex legal process. The criminal case against Richard will take months to resolve, possibly years. During that time, your divorce proceedings will be on hold, but the asset freeze protects your interests. What should I expect? How will this affect my day-to-day life? You'll be called to testify in the criminal case, both before a grand jury and potentially at trial. But remember, you're testifying as a victim, not as a defendant. The prosecutors want to see Richard convicted, and your testimony helps them achieve that goal. Agent Collins handed Linda a business card with her direct contact information. Miss Harper, if your husband attempts to contact you again, especially if he makes any threats or tries to persuade you to change your testimony, call me immediately. We take witness intimidation very seriously in federal cases. As the federal agents packed up their equipment and prepared to leave, Linda stood in her dining room, surrounded by the controlled chaos of a house that had been thoroughly searched. Furniture had been moved, files had been examined, computers had been seized. Her home looked like a crime scene, which, she realized with dark humor, it actually was. Margaret arrived just as the last federal vehicle pulled out of the driveway, carrying her usual arsenal of comfort food and fierce loyalty. She took one look at Linda's exhausted expression and immediately began making tea and organizing the displaced furniture. Linda, how are you holding up? This must have been incredibly overwhelming. Margaret, it was actually empowering. For the first time in 45 years, I felt like someone was taking my side, fighting for my interests, instead of just expecting me to quietly accept whatever Richard decided. Margaret settled onto the sofa beside Linda, her expression serious and concerned. What happens now? Are you safe here alone? The federal agents don't think Richard poses a physical threat, but they've advised me to change the locks and install a security system. David Rodriguez thinks Richard will be arrested within days, possibly by the end of the week. And then what? Will you stay in this house? Linda looked around the living room that had been her sanctuary for over 2 decades, seeing it with new eyes. No, I don't think so. This house represents everything about my marriage that was built on lies. I want to start fresh somewhere new, somewhere that's entirely mine. Margaret squeezed Linda's hand. With the money you're going to receive from the divorce settlement, you can live anywhere you want. You could travel, buy a house in any city that appeals to you, even live abroad if you want. For the first time since this ordeal began, Linda allowed herself to truly consider her future possibilities. She was about to become a wealthy woman in her own right, with the freedom to make choices based on her own desires rather than Richard's plans. She could return to teaching if she wanted, pursue the advanced degree she'd always dreamed of, or explore entirely new interests. Margaret, I think I want to go back to school, maybe get a master's degree in literature or education. I've always regretted not finishing my education when I got married. Linda, you could endow an entire scholarship program if you wanted. You could establish a foundation for women escaping abusive marriages, fund educational programs for displaced homemakers, The possibilities are endless. As evening approached and Margaret prepared to leave, Linda received a text message from Elizabeth Chen. Federal agents recovered everything we hoped for and more. Richard's criminal exposure is extensive. You're going to be very satisfied with the final outcome. Linda smiled as she read the message, feeling something she hadn't experienced in decades: excitement about her future. Richard had told her she was past her expiration date, but he'd been wrong about everything else, and he was wrong about that too. Her real life was just beginning, and this time, she would be writing the rules. The call came at 7:15 on a crisp Thursday morning 3 days later. Linda was in her garden pulling weeds with a vigor that had surprised her over the past week, when her phone buzzed with Agent Collins' number. "Mrs. Harper, I wanted to let you know that Richard Harper was arrested at his office 20 minutes ago. He's currently being processed and will be arraigned later today." Linda sat back on her heels, dirt-stained gardening gloves still on her hands, processing the finality of those words. After 45 years of marriage, her husband was now a federal defendant facing decades in prison. The man who had controlled every aspect of their financial life was about to discover what it felt like to have no control at all. What are the specific charges? 18 counts including tax evasion, wire fraud, money laundering, and identity theft. The identity theft charges relate specifically to his use of your name and social security number to establish fraudulent companies. The federal prosecutor expects to file additional charges as the investigation continues. Agent Collins paused, and Linda could hear papers rustling in the background. "Mrs. Harper, I also wanted to inform you that Mr. Harper's bail hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Given the flight risk he represents and the severity of the charges, the prosecution will be arguing for denial of bail." Linda thanked Agent Collins and ended the call, then sat in her garden for several more minutes, absorbing the magnitude of what had just happened. The man who had dismissed her as past her expiration date was now facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in federal prison. The irony was not lost on her. Elizabeth Chen called an hour later with updates on the financial aspects of the case. "Linda, the federal asset forfeiture has been expanded to include properties and accounts that weren't initially frozen. Based on the evidence recovered during the searches, we now have a complete picture of Richard's hidden wealth." How complete? $63.2 million in total assets, including real estate, investment accounts, and business holdings. As his spouse, you're entitled to half of everything acquired during the marriage, which represents the vast majority of his wealth. Linda felt her breath catch. $63 million was beyond anything she had imagined possible. It was enough money to last several lifetimes, enough to fund any dream or ambition she might develop, enough to make her one of the wealthiest women in the state. "Elizabeth, what about the criminal aspect? Does his arrest affect the divorce proceedings?" "Actually, it simplifies everything dramatically. Federal prosecutors are eager to cooperate with your divorce attorney to ensure that victim restitution is maximized. They want Richard to forfeit as much as possible, but they also want to ensure that you receive everything you're legally entitled to." Elizabeth's voice carried a note of satisfaction that Linda had come to associate with major victory. More importantly, Richard's arrest means he has no leverage left in the divorce negotiations. "His attorney contacted me this morning, wanting to discuss a settlement. Richard is now desperate to resolve the divorce quickly to minimize his criminal exposure." "What kind of settlement are they proposing?" "Full disclosure of all assets, a 50-50 split of everything acquired during the marriage, plus additional compensation for the identity theft and financial fraud you suffered. We're talking about you receiving approximately $35 million in cash and assets, plus ongoing royalties from several of his business ventures." Linda walked inside her house, moving through rooms that would soon belong to someone else, but no longer feeling displaced or unwelcome. She was choosing to leave this house behind, not being forced out of it. The difference was profound. When will this be finalized? The divorce settlement could be completed within 60 days if Richard continues to cooperate. His criminal case will take much longer, but the civil aspects of your situation can be resolved quickly. Elizabeth paused meaningfully. "Linda, you're about to become one of the most successful divorce plaintiffs in state history." That afternoon, Linda received an unexpected visitor. Michael, her son, arrived without warning, his usually composed surgeon's demeanor replaced by obvious agitation and concern. "Mom, what the hell is going on? Dad called me from jail this morning, claiming you've somehow orchestrated his arrest on false charges. But then I got a call from a federal agent saying he's been charged with major financial crimes." Linda gestured for Michael to sit in the living room where she'd spent countless evenings during her marriage, never imagining she was sharing her life with a criminal. "Michael, your father has been lying to all of us for years. He's been hiding millions of dollars and committing federal crimes to do it." Michael ran his hands through his hair, a gesture he'd inherited from Richard but which looked entirely different on him. "Mom, Dad told me you hired some kind of forensic accountant to destroy his business out of spite over the divorce. He says you're trying to frame him for crimes he never committed." "Michael, federal agents don't arrest people based on spite. They arrest them based on evidence, and the evidence against your father is overwhelming." Linda handed Michael a folder containing copies of some of the documents Elizabeth had provided. "Your father has been using my identity to commit fraud for years. He forged a prenuptial agreement and hid over $60 million in assets." Michael studied the documents with the analytical precision he brought to medical diagnoses, his expression shifting from skepticism to shock to anger, as he absorbed the implications of what he was reading. "Mom, if this is accurate, Dad has been committing serious federal crimes. These shell companies, these hidden accounts, this isn't just hiding money from a divorce. This is organized financial fraud. Your father built his entire business on criminal activity, and he used our marriage as cover for his crimes. When he decided to divorce me, he thought he could keep all the money he'd stolen while leaving me with nothing." Michael set down the papers and looked at his mother with new understanding. "And instead, you caught him. I caught him, the federal government caught him, and now he's facing decades in prison while I'm about to become independently wealthy." Linda smiled at her son with a mixture of sadness and satisfaction. "Michael, your father told me I was past my expiration date, but he was wrong. My real life is just getting started." Patricia arrived from San Francisco the next day, and Linda found herself explaining the situation again to her daughter, whose marketing executive's understanding of business made her particularly horrified by the scope of Richard's deception. "Mom, do you realize what this means for his business reputation? Everything Dad built over the past 2 decades is going to be revealed as fraudulent. His clients, his investors, his political connections, they're all going to distance themselves from him immediately." Linda hadn't considered the broader social implications of Richard's arrest, but Patricia was right. Within days, Richard would go from being a respected businessman and community leader to being a pariah whose very name would be associated with criminal fraud. "Does that bother you? The public humiliation aspect?" "Mom, I'm furious that he put our family in this position, but I'm also proud of you for fighting back. What he did to you was unconscionable, and he deserves everything he's about to face." Both children stayed for the weekend, helping Linda sort through decades of possessions and decide what she wanted to keep for her new life. The process was therapeutic, allowing her to literally separate her identity from the marriage that had defined her for so long. On Monday morning, Linda drove to the courthouse for Richard's bail hearing, not to support him but to witness the formal beginning of his legal downfall. She sat in the gallery with David Rodriguez, watching as her husband of 45 years was led into the courtroom in an orange jumpsuit, his hands shackled, his normally perfect appearance disheveled and defeated. The federal prosecutor presented a compelling case for denying bail, citing the extensive evidence of financial crimes, the significant flight risk Richard represented, and the ongoing investigation that suggested additional charges would be filed. Richard's attorney made weak arguments about his community ties and lack of prior criminal history, but the judge was clearly unimpressed. "Mr. Harper, the evidence presented by the government suggests that you have engaged in systematic criminal activity spanning more than a decade. You have demonstrated a pattern of deception, you have access to hidden financial resources, and you represent a significant flight risk. Bail is denied." Richard turned in his seat, scanning the gallery until his eyes found Linda. For a moment their gazes locked across the courtroom, and she saw in his expression a mixture of rage, disbelief, and something that might have been regret. But it was too late for regret, far too late for apologies or explanation. As Richard was led away to begin what would likely be years of pre-trial detention, Linda felt a profound sense of closure. The man who had controlled her life for decades had just lost control of his own life permanently. Elizabeth called that afternoon with news that the divorce settlement negotiations had been completed. "Linda, Richard's attorney has agreed to everything we demanded: full asset disclosure, equal division of marital property, and additional compensation for the fraud you suffered. You'll receive $38.7 million in cash and assets. When will this be finalized? The papers will be ready for signature by the end of the week. Once you sign, you'll be officially divorced and independently wealthy." Linda hung up the phone and walked through her house one final time, seeing it now as a chapter that was ending rather than a life that was being destroyed. She'd already put a deposit on a charming Victorian house near the college where she planned to return to school, a house with a library that would be perfect for her studies, and a garden where she could grow whatever she chose. Margaret arrived for dinner carrying champagne and wearing the biggest smile Linda had seen since this ordeal began. "Linda Harper, you are officially the most successful divorcee in the history of this county. $38 million and your freedom from that lying, cheating, criminal husband." They sat on Linda's porch as the sun set over the neighborhood where she'd lived as Mrs. Richard Harper for the last time. Tomorrow she would be Linda Morrison again, a name she hadn't used in 45 years but which now felt like coming home to herself. "Margaret, do you think I should feel guilty about being happy that Richard is in jail?" "Linda, that man stole decades of your life through systematic deception. He planned to discard you while keeping money that was legally yours. He used your identity to commit federal crimes without your knowledge. You should feel proud that you fought back and won." Margaret raised her champagne glass in a toast. "To Linda Morrison, who discovered that being past your expiration date, according to one lying man, actually means you're just getting started on your real life." Linda raised her glass and smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "To trust funds that are just getting started." 6 months later, Linda sat in her new library in her Victorian house, surrounded by graduate school textbooks and research materials for her master's thesis on women's literature. At 68, she was the oldest student in her program and absolutely the happiest. Her $38 million settlement had been finalized, her divorce was complete, and Richard was serving the first year of what would be a 25-year federal prison sentence. She'd established a foundation to help women escape abusive marriages, funded scholarships for displaced homemakers returning to school, and traveled to places she'd only dreamed of seeing during her marriage. But more importantly, she'd rediscovered who Linda Morrison was beneath 45 years of being Richard Harper's wife. Her phone rang with a call from Elizabeth Chen, who had become not just her attorney but her friend. "Linda, I have news. The federal government has recovered additional assets from Richard's criminal enterprise. You're entitled to another $4.2 million as victim restitution." Linda laughed, a sound that had become much more frequent in her new life. "Elizabeth, at this point I have so much money I don't know what to do with it all." "That's a wonderful problem to have. But Linda, I called for another reason. I have a potential client whose situation is very similar to what yours was. She's been married for 37 years to a man who just announced he's divorcing her to marry his secretary. She has no idea about their finances and feels completely helpless. And you want me to talk to her. I want you to show her what's possible when you refuse to accept someone else's valuation of your worth." Linda smiled, already reaching for her calendar. She'd become something she'd never expected to be, a warrior for women who'd been dismissed and discarded by men who underestimated them. "Send me her information. I'll call her today." As Linda ended the call and returned to her studies, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from Richard's cruel pronouncement about her expiration date to this moment of complete independence and purpose. He'd been wrong about everything, but he'd been most wrong about her. Her trust fund hadn't just gotten started, her entire life had begun again. And this time, she was the only one writing the rules. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.